Ethereal Preston, or The Adventures of a Newcomer, by Father Francis J. Finn, S.J. Chapter 1. A Letter from Ethelred's Mamma. Seated at his desk on a bright Wednesday morning towards the end of January, Father Edmonds, the Reverend President of Henryton College, was gazing with a look of weariness upon the enormous mass of papers, pamphlets, and letters piled up before him. The gaze and the weariness lasted but a moment, and then he fixed his eyeglasses firmly upon his nose and set to work at distribution. While slipping the letters from his hand to a tablet at his side, he scanned their superscriptions, dropping some to the right and a great many to his left. The larger pile thus formed was made up of letters addressed to the students, and the smaller of those addressed to himself and his community. From the letters, Father Edmonds went to the pamphlets, magazines, and newspapers, and here the waste-paper basket came into service. With dexterity born of long experience, the president could ascertain, in most cases at a glance, and without opening their wrappers, the general character. Before he had done with examining these, the waste-basket had received a very generous moiety of current literature. The morning's mail thus sorted, Father Edmonds touched his bell, in answer to which a young gentleman, his private secretary, entered the room. "For the vice president," said Father Edmonds, pointing to the mail of the students. The secretary bowed, took the mail in his hands, and withdrew. Having thus narrowed his field of labor, Father Edmonds addressed himself to a more careful examination. Again taking up the letters, he selected his own. Opening these, he skimmed rapidly over the first 5, pigeonholing 3 and dropping 2 into the waste-basket. But the 6th letter gave him pause. It was enclosed in a dainty, scented, square envelope. It was very lengthy production, setting aside the evidence of perfumery. The communication was evidently the work of a woman. It was written down and across the page in fat, sprawling letters, where M's and W's and X's and V's were utterly indistinguishable. Father Edmonds sighed. He had struggled through such letters before. Nothing could be skipped, nothing taken for granted. Not infrequently, the most important part of such missives was to be found where crossings were thickest. He began then the reading with mild resignation. Suddenly an expression of awakening interest and came upon his features. As he reached the 3rd page, a smile began to flicker. It burst into a flame at the 4th and blazing on merrily to the end, when he exclaimed, "Little Lord Fauntleroy II." He laughed quietly and added, "I fancy the small boys of Henryton College are going to be awakened from their midwinter dullness. I must see the vice president at once." "Father Howard," he exclaimed, as he entered the vice president's room a moment later, "have you room in the junior division for a little Lord Fauntleroy?" "I have, certainly, but I'm not so sure about the boys. They may try in their innocent but abrupt way to find out whether he is really and truly real." "Well, it would appear that he is real enough. Just read this letter." Father Howard took the scented envelope, drew out the enclosed, and this is what it read. "Reverend Edmund C. Edmonds. Reverend dear Sir, it is after reflection and thought and many tears that I address myself to your kindness. I now find myself, dear Reverend Sir, forced to face a trial which, alas, but 1 week ago I could not so much as have financed. My darling little boy and I must part. Ah, dear Father, if you but knew what that meant. No one but a mother can appreciate the grief which fills my heart. The dear child is the picture of his father. He is lovely and innocent and has never been away from my side, not even for 1 day. Whatever he knows, and he has gone quite far in spelling and botany, including the language of flowers. I have taught him myself, and in my teachings I have addressed myself to the heart rather to the head. He is not at all like other boys, of whom it may be said that they are uniformly rude, but has all the refinements of a young lady. He is docile, amiable, cheerful, and happy. As the day is long, the sweetest child imaginable. All his little ways are lovely. He is generous to a fault, in which he resembles his father, and is as sensitive as I was in the days of my youth, and conscientious to a degree approaching scrupulosity. And yet I am not, after the fashion of most mothers, blind to his faults. My little Ethelwald is just the least trifle impetuous and inconsiderate. By those who do not understand him, he might even be called thoughtless. Nevertheless, he is so open to reason. A little talk, if kindly and considerately given, and accompanied with a little coaxing, will never fail to bring him to his senses. He has never been subjected to corporal punishment. The dear child is high-strung, and so nervous, and would be injured for life by such barbarous treatment. Under no circumstances must this child be touched. This point I insist upon. Ethelrod is a delicate child. Just after teething, he contracted a severe illness. Here the fond mother goes into a detailed account of all Master Ethelrod's various ailments and maladies, and mentioning, incidentally, but at some length, several diseases which, by an especial providence, he has just narrowly escaped. As these details are of little interest to the public at large and do not bear directly upon the story, I omit them. Now, dear Reverend Sir, in view of what I have told you, you must see how necessary it is that the greatest care be taken of Ethelrod's health. He should get a glass of milk at least 4 times a day, twice in the morning and twice in the afternoon. The boy should by all means bring a cow along, muttered the vice president. If possible, he should have sweetbread every morning at breakfast, and a glass of port wine at dinner, and dry toast at supper. He should bring his cook along, too, interjected the president. Ethelrod is not a Catholic. I am an Episcopalian in theory, and my dear boy will probably join the same church. I am not a bigoted woman, and believe that there are good Catholics, many of whom will doubtless go to heaven. My boy is naturally very religious, and I sent him to your school because I understand that the moral training there is excellent. Miss Martin, whose nephew, Earl Merriweather, attends your college, gives me an excellent account of it. I do not know Earl personally, though his lamented mother and I were most intimate friends at school, and I feel that Earl, whose reputation stands very high, will be a suitable companion for my boy, as far as any boy can be a suitable companion for one who has had such home training as my Ethelrod has enjoyed. If there are any good Catholic boys attending your college, supposing, of course, that their manners make some such approach towards refinement as we have reason to expect of boys of the better classes, I see no objection to my boys associating with them under due inspection. I am so agitated, dear Reverend Sir, that I find it almost impossible to put my thoughts on paper with any appearance of order. I should ere this have explained to you my reason for being obliged to separate myself from my sweet child. It is inevitable. Yesterday I received a telegram from London, England, stating that my husband has there been attacked by hemorrhages, and that his position is precarious. Of course, I must start by the next steamer. Gladly would I bring my little Ethelrod along, but the poor child is so sensitive in seasickness that it would be literally flying in the face of Providence to imperil his precarious health, mayhaps his life, by taking him along. The parting is difficult, but it must be made. Again and again I beg you to bestow every attention upon my darling, and a mother's prayer and a mother's blessing will accompany you through life. Thanking you in advance for your kindnesses, and asking you to overlook the inaccuracies and blunders of a well-nigh distracted mother, I am, dear Reverend Sir, yours most earnestly and beseechingly, Elinor Preston. P.S. Enclosed you will find a check for a bank note. I am not quite sure of the correct term, for $400 for Ethelrod's expenses. On reaching London, I shall forward more. My child will reach you on Thursday morning. I have been holding him back in hopes of getting some trusted friend to accompany him on this trip. I would go myself, but could hardly do so without missing the first steamer. Be a father, dear Reverend Sir, to my precious darling. E.P. Such a boy, the President remarked, hardly requires testimonials as to his character. Not if he's anything at all like what his mother makes him out to be, answered Father Howard. Let us hope that he really is a swan in the eyes of others than his fond parents. Meantime, it would be good to write for a reference. If you have no objection, I shall attend to this part of the matter myself. And there was no objection. On the next morning, at about the same hour, the college porter brought Father Edmunds a card. He read with a smile, Master Ethelrod Preston, Albany Villa, Brighton, at home Tuesdays. I'm on my road to meet our little Lord Fauntleroy, said Father Edmunds, as he encountered the vice-president in the hall. Father Edmunds was a man whom long experienced as a disciplinarian and as a superior had schooled in the control of his emotions. But as he entered the parlor and glanced at the new pupil, he started back, while a slight exclamation forced itself from his lips, and he had reason for being astonished. Chapter 2, in which things begin to go badly with Earl Merryweather. While Father Edmunds was mastering his astonishment in the parlor, matters were not proceeding with their wonted smoothness. In the class of first academics, there was a frown upon the brow of Professor Mr. Glade. He was explaining the sequence of tenses for the 14th or 15th time, be it said, and eyeing as he spoke a young gentleman in one of the corner seats. If he counted upon catching the pupil's eye, he must have been disappointed. The boy was scribbling very industriously, and according to all seeming, utterly oblivious to everything about him, save the sheet of paper across which his pencil was traveling. The professor finally paused, his face turned a shade paler, and the enormous frown deepened upon his forehead. Everyone in the class, with the exception of the scribbler, showed manifest signs of uneasiness. This thing has gone too far, said Mr. Gade, changing his tone of voice. He spoke low because he was indignant. At the words Earl Merryweather, the scribbler, looked up inquiringly. Yes, Merryweather, I mean you. For 5 minutes I have been explaining the sequence of tenses, principally for your benefit. The theme you handed in this morning shows me that if you ever knew anything about the construction of a Latin sentence, you have almost utterly forgotten it. And now, while I explain, you must devote yourself to other work. I have been very much disappointed in you of late. Your conduct has pained and annoyed me. Please leave the room. Mr. Gade seldom spoke in reproof to his pupils, but when he did so speak, his admonitions carried weight. The boys valued his kind words, and, loving him, dreaded his displeasure, above all punishment. There had fallen a strained silence upon the room as the professor spoke, and one could see by the expression on the students' faces that the scene was painful and uneasy. Merryweather himself had first given a start when his name was called out, and as Mr. Gade had gone on, a look of pained surprise had come upon his features. At the command to leave the room, he turned very red, compressed his lips, and putting his hands into his pockets, strode out with something of a swagger. This air of defiance and the manner of his accent confirmed Mr. Gade in the impression that the rebuke was well merited. Then the class work proceeded as usual, and yet with a difference. The boys were serious and subdued in manner, and the little undercurrent of pleasantry which often exists in a class along with perfect order and attention, and with certain professors of sunny temperament, find it to their account to foster, was congealed for that day. It was like the funeral without the carriage ride, said Roger Hines to Edward Devereux, as they came out together into the playground at recess. So it was, assented Devereux. A fellow doesn't know how much fun he's having in our class till something goes wrong, and then he knew it by not having it. But what's coming over Earl Merryweather, anyhow, these last few weeks? He used to be a great friend of Mr. Gade's, and never handed in a single paper that wasn't among the very best. Yesterday, when Mr. Gade passed a lot of us fellows in the yard, we all took off our hats, and to him, except Earl. And the worst of it was that Earl walked right past Mr. Gade and took no notice at all of his nod and smile. Our teacher flushed, and we could see that he was annoyed. Something has gone wrong with Earl. He doesn't seem to be the same boy at all that he used to be. He never was very lively, but now he's positively gloomy. He's the best friend I ever had, and it makes me blue to see him going down in this way. I'm really puzzled about the whole thing. He's the most popular boy in school still, but he's going to lose his popularity if he doesn't take care. I thought there would be a row soon, said Roger. Earl has got to be very negligent in his studies, and from being the leader he is now getting down to the foot. I don't think he has given a good recitation for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've been expecting Mr. Gade to call him down this long time. I feel very bad about the whole affair, continued Devereux. Earl and I have been chums, and besides liking him, I respect him more than any boy I ever met. Of late he hasn't been with me. He's always in the reading room and doesn't do anything but read and take notes. I have felt like having a good talk with him a dozen times, but the chance has never afforded itself, and I have been too careless to put myself to a little trouble. You ought to talk to Earl, Ed. If you don't, I'll do it myself, though I don't know him near as well as you do. All right, I'll do it, though I'm afraid that he will hardly be in any humor just now for anything I have to say. There he is over near the playroom. Catch him and strike him while the iron is hot. I say, Earl, said Devereux a moment later, as he placed his hand on Earl's shoulder and fell into step with him on the walk running beside the playroom. What's the trouble between you and Mr. Gade? You used to get along as well with him, and now it's all at 6s and 7s between you. Ed paused for an answer, but none came. He looked up presently in Earl's face, and then he understood. Earl's face was quivering with emotion, and there was a suspicious moisture in his eyes. Oh, I say, Earl, don't take it so hard, pleaded his soft-hearted Ed. We all get a scolding now and then, you know, and I suppose that most of us deserve it every time. Do you think I deserve that scolding? Asked Earl. Since you ask it, returned Ed, I must say I do. All the fellows think the same. Again Earl's features were convulsed. He struggled for a moment, and then, unable longer to restrain himself, he broke away from his astonished and dismayed companion, and seeking a quiet spot gave full vent to his emotion. This was Earl's 3rd year at college, and Ed Duvoir was the first and only boy who had ever seen him shed a tear. The few minutes of the present recess promised to be of importance in the shaping of Earl's life. Matters had seemingly come to a head. Earl had been a student at Henryton College for 2 years and a half. During this period, he had enjoyed the popularity of the boys and the respect of the faculty. He was a lad of somewhat serious turn of mind, remarkably earnest, and in everything, and very noticeably for his piety, he was a Lutheran, and practiced his religion in a manner that surprised and edified his fellow students. Indeed, his simple and frank piety had often put to shame some of the more negligent Catholic boys. His conduct in the chapel and at prayers was such that many of his companions had been as long as a year with him before learning that he was not of their religion. He won the name of being a deeply religious lad early in his first year at Henryton. It happened during the celebration of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, at which, according to the custom of Henryton College, all of the students assisted. The boy next him was behaving rather lightly and several times tried to secure Earl's attention. Earl, with his eyes fastened upon his own book of devotion, refused to recognize his companion's advances. After Mass, however, he awaited the irreverent youngster outside. "Ed Duvoir, I'm going to ask you an earnest question. I want an earnest answer. Will you give it?" "Of course," answered Ed. "Do you really believe that Christ is present in the Blessed Sacrament of the altar?" "If I were able, I'd lick the man who said I didn't," returned Tiny Ed, with flashing eyes and considerable vehemence. "Well, then, I can't for the life of me understand how you can carry on in the chapel the way you do, if you really believe. I'm not a Catholic myself, and I certainly never will be one, but I try to show reverence in chapel out of respect for the opinions of the Catholic boys around me. I don't understand your position, Ed." When Ed learned then and there for the first time that the boy who sat beside him at service was not Catholic, he stared with dismay and surprise, and his rebuke humbled him as he never had been humbled before. His face flushed scarlet. He looked in dumb, pitiful distress at Earl for a moment, and then returned to the chapel. From that hour dated Ed's profound reverence for the real presence. From that hour dated his love and respect for Earl, which had gone on increasing month by month. He did not answer Earl's question, and indeed never referred to that conversation but once. Then he said, "Earl, when you spoke to me about my behavior in the chapel, you said, among other things, that you never intended to become a Catholic. Did you really mean that?" "Indeed I did," answered Earl. "Well, I hope that my disgraceful conduct had nothing to do with your intention. It's been bothering me ever since." "That had nothing whatever to do with it, my resolve," said Earl. "Well, perhaps my conduct, along with the conduct of some of the other fellows, may have been the cause. Now you know, Earl, we all of us Catholic boys here believe all right, but we're young and giddy, and I suppose, and don't think. Some of us trifle at times in the chapel without thinking of what we're doing. Sometimes a boy actually doesn't know that he's fooling. There's a boy here now who seems to be most irreverent in the chapel, and yet I know that he prays hard, and all the fellows know that he wouldn't do anything wrong for the world. Yet, if you watched him at the service, you would hardly think him a Catholic. You see—" "Hold on," cried Earl. "You needn't explain the way some of you fellows carry on. I wouldn't understand any explanation anyhow. It wasn't on the account either that I made my resolve. The fact is, I had a promise that I would be true to my own religion when I was a little boy of 7, nearly 8 years ago. You did? Yes. Would you like to hear how it happened? Indeed, I would. It's a long story, Ed, and you're the only person I've ever offered to tell it. Devore's face flushed with genuine pleasure as these words came. He had come to look upon to this Lutheran boy with an admiration which was made up of reverence and love. Such a friendship is rarely inspired. It supposes on the part of him who is thus admired a strength of character, a sincerity, and a manliness that are seldom found in one person. Nothing would pleasure me better than to hear it, said Ed. It's a long story, as I said, and not particularly interesting in itself. I would think even of telling it to you, only I know and value the interest you take in me, and I feel sure that you will be interested. And with this somewhat awkward introduction, Earl told his story. Now, as Earl's early life has much to do with what is to come, I shall tell the reader Merryweather's history as he related it to Ed, with certain details such as the honest boy's modesty forbade him divulge even to his bosom friend.